The air was thick with anticipation as the lights dimmed and the crowd roared. I stood backstage, my heart pounding in my chest. The energy was electric, and I knew that in just a few moments, Elvis Presley would take the stage. It was a typical night for me, Dr. George Nichopoulos, Elvis's personal physician. But this night was different. This night I had a feeling that something was off. Elvis had been struggling more than usual lately. The pressure, the fame, the constant scrutiny, it was all taking a toll on him. He was a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, and it was starting to show. I had tried my best to help him, but sometimes even the best intentions fall short. As I watched him from the wings, I could see the tension in his body. His eyes were glassy, and his hands were trembling. He had been on a strict regime of medications to manage his pain and anxiety, but tonight, it seemed like nothing was working. I knew he was nervous, and I could see the fear in his eyes. He wanted to give his fans the best performance, but he was fighting a battle within himself. "Doc, I can't do this tonight," Elvis said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes met mine, and I could see the desperation in them. I placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "You can do this, Elvis, you always do. Just take a deep breath and let the music take over." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. I could feel the tension radiating from him, and I knew that if he didn't take the stage soon, the crowd would start to get restless. Just as he was about to step out, something caught my eye. A small, crumpled piece of paper on the floor. I picked it up and my heart sank. It was a prescription, but it wasn't one I had written. It was for a powerful sedative, and the dosage was dangerously high. My mind raced. Who had given this to him, and why? "Elvis, wait," I said, grabbing his arm. "We need to talk about this." He pulled away, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and fear. "Doc, I need this. I can't go out there without it." I knew I had to act fast. "Elvis, listen to me. This isn't safe. We need to find another way." He hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he might listen. But then the spotlight hit the stage, and the crowd's cheers grew louder. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, leaving me standing there helpless. As the music started, I watched him from the wings, my heart heavy with concern. He was a performer, a showman, and he knew how to work a crowd. But I could see the strain on his face, the way his movements were less fluid, less natural. He was pushing himself, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something broke. The set went on, and I stayed backstage, ready to step in if anything went wrong. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Something was different, and I had a sinking feeling that it would only get worse. When the show finally ended and Elvis came back to the dressing room, he was exhausted. He collapsed onto the couch, his body shaking. I approached him, trying to stay calm. "Elvis, we need to talk about what happened tonight. This can't go on." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "I know, Doc, I'm trying, but it's getting harder every day." I nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "We'll figure it out, Elvis, we always do." But as I left the dressing room that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing. The pressure, the pain, the constant struggle, it was all taking its toll. And I knew that no matter what I did, the road ahead was going to be a difficult one. Dr. Nick's heart raced as he drove toward Graceland. The words, "Something's happened to Elvis," echoed in his mind. He had known Elvis for years, and the two of them had been through a lot. Dr. Nick had seen Elvis at his best and his worst, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility. As he pulled up to the mansion, the familiar orange-striped ambulance was already waiting. Dr. Nick rushed over and climbed into the back, where Elvis lay on a gurney. Joe and Charlie were there too, their faces pale with fear. The paramedic was already working on Elvis, trying to get him to breathe. Dr. Nick took charge, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. Elvis's face was swollen and blue, a sign of severe oxygen deprivation. Dr. Nick's mind raced through all the possibilities: a heart attack, a seizure, an overdose, or maybe even a fall. He knew they needed to act fast, but the tight space in the ambulance made it difficult. They tried to intubate Elvis, but his neck wouldn't cooperate, and they couldn't see his vocal cords clearly. Without a clear airway, they resorted to bag breathing, forcing air into his lungs. Elvis's heart had stopped. Dr. Nick and the paramedic took turns performing chest compressions, alternating with injections of medications to try to restart Elvis's heart. The monitor showed no signs of life. The small emergency vehicle felt hotter and hotter as their efforts became more frantic. Dr. Nick's heart sank with each passing minute. Finally, they reached Baptist Memorial Hospital. The doors of the ambulance flew open, and the gurney was rushed inside. Dr. Nick followed, his mind still racing with hope. In the trauma room, the Harvey team took over, their skilled hands moving with precision. Stimulation drugs were injected, and electric shocks were delivered to Elvis's chest. For a brief moment, the monitor showed a few weak beats, but they quickly faded. Dr. Nick watched, his eyes blurred with tears. He couldn't bear to accept that Elvis was gone. But the longer they worked, the more he realized it was too late. The small window of opportunity to save Elvis's brain had closed. The air Joe had heard was just a positional movement, not a sign of life. The doctors looked at Dr. Nick, waiting for him to make the call. With a heavy heart, he whispered, "Stop CPR, he's gone." The room fell silent, and the team slowly stepped back, their faces filled with exhaustion and sorrow. Dr. Nick's shock began to wear off, and he realized he had to face the others. Vernon, Elvis's father, and the rest of the guys were waiting in the next room. Dr. Nick's tears ran down his cheeks as he opened the door. The room was silent until he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's all over, he's gone." The room erupted in wails of disbelief and grief. Dr. Nick felt a deep sense of loss, but he knew he had to be strong for those who loved Elvis. He took a deep breath and prepared to face the hard days ahead. The scene at the hospital was tense. Joe Esposito and Charlie Hodge stood with Al Strada, Elvis's trusted aide who managed his wardrobe and personal matters. Billy Smith, Elvis's cousin who was more like a brother, and David Stanley, Elvis's stepbrother who also worked as an aide and helped with security, were there too. David's mother, Dee, who was married to but separated from Elvis's father, was also present. Dick Grob, Elvis's chief of security, had arrived to manage the press, who were becoming increasingly aggressive, trying to get a scoop on Elvis's condition. I wanted to stay with the guys to comfort each other, but there was an urgent need at Graceland. I had to go there because hope was fading, and there were other matters I needed to discuss with Vernon that would be hard to hear. Being a doctor and a friend to Elvis was tough. Everyone expected me to do something magical, just like I had done before during several serious events. But this time, I wasn't there when Elvis needed me most. It turned out that the people hired to look out for him weren't there either, despite all the precautions we had put in place. Dick Grob and Al Strada stayed at the hospital for security, and Joe Esposito stayed to make the official announcement of Elvis's death at a press conference. I planned to call from Graceland to confirm that the Presley family had been informed, so the world could be told. Joe had been Elvis's right-hand man since they were in the army together in Germany. He knew exactly what needed to be done to prevent the news from leaking to the press. His first call was to Elvis's longtime manager, Tom Parker, known as the Colonel. Joe had to cancel the upcoming concert dates. Next he called Elvis's ex-wife, Priscilla, to tell her the news. He knew how important it was for her to hear it from him, especially for the sake of their 9-year-old daughter, Lisa Marie, who was at Graceland for the summer. The paramedics got permission for me to ride back to Graceland in the ambulance, just in case we needed to take Vernon to the hospital. Elvis's father, Vernon, had a weak heart, and he had recently had a second heart attack. I prayed he could handle this devastating news. When we arrived at Graceland, the crowd outside had grown. I entered through the back door, which I had used many times over the years. This time it felt different. I walked quietly into Grandma Minnie-Me's room, where Lisa Marie and other loved ones were waiting with her, praying. Everyone's face was tear-streaked. Vernon and his fiancée, Sandy Miller, Vernon's sister, Delta Biggs, and the maids and other family members. The moment I walked in, Vernon knew. "Oh no, no," he moaned. The entire room broke into tears. It was the most heart-wrenching scene I had ever seen. It felt like a Greek funeral, where everyone joined in the crying and wailing. After a few minutes, it was time to make the official call. I walked past the kitchen where I could see the crowd outside growing. I picked up the phone and dialed the hospital. "Joe, you can give the press its story. I said, my voice heavy with resignation. We gathered in the den to watch the press conference on the TV. The news was broadcast, and the reality hit us all. Even when trusted news sources announced it, many people thought it was a hoax. They had to hear it several times before it sank in. Elvis Presley, the 42-year-old king of rock and roll, died today in Memphis, Tennessee. Vernon seemed subdued after the news. I asked if I could examine him, and was relieved to find no chest pains. He was surprisingly coherent and focused, ready to carry on as best he could. But we still needed to discuss the need for an autopsy. Dick Grobb, who had a background in law enforcement and was a trusted friend, arrived from the hospital. We explained the process to Vernon and why it was necessary. If the death was ruled natural, the body would be released to the family and an autopsy could be requested. Vernon, despite his shaky hand, signed the permission paper. Dan Warlick, the chief medical investigator, took charge of the investigation. His team searched Elvis's room and found no drugs, only 2 large syringes used by dentists. The maids had cleaned the room, which raised some questions. They said they always cleaned Elvis's room when he left the house. The detectives interviewed everyone who was there, trying to piece together what happened. I was interviewed by Warlick and was exhausted afterward. My son, Dean, offered to drive me back to the hospital for the autopsy. On the way, he shared what he had heard at Graceland. Elvis had spent the night with Ginger, his girlfriend. He called me around 1:30 a.m., then talked with Joe about tour details and met with Dick to discuss security. Later, he played racquetball with Ginger and Billy. After returning to the house, Elvis asked for some sleep medicine and spoke with Tish, the nurse. Delta brought him the medicine. Elvis couldn't sleep, so he went to the bathroom to read. Ginger woke up around 2 p.m. and found Elvis lying face down on the carpet. She called for help, and the maids couldn't find David, who was supposed to be on duty. Sandy and Vernon tried to revive Elvis until the ambulance arrived. Dean pointed out some suspicious details. Rick and David, who were supposed to be on duty, were nowhere to be found when Elvis needed them. The maids heard a loud thump around 1 p.m., which might have been when Elvis fell. They also noticed that Ginger was fully dressed and had perfect makeup when she sounded the alarm, which seemed odd since she had been sleeping for hours. These details added more questions to the already painful situation. We all hoped the autopsy would provide some answers. I answered, confused by all the new information. All I know is that when Elvis called me this morning, he said his tooth was hurting. He asked if I could give him something for the pain. I didn't have my medical bag at home, so I told him I'd have to write a prescription. He said he'd send Rick to get it. After we hung up, I called the house and confirmed that Elvis had been to the dentist. Then I wrote a prescription for a few Dilaudid tablets. I called the hospital's all-night pharmacy and told the pharmacist that Rick was coming with a prescription for Elvis. That's the last time I saw Rick around 2:30 this morning at our house. Dean asked, I saw you talking with the investigator. How did that go? That was Dan Warlick. He wanted to know why there were no medicine bottles in Elvis's bedroom or bathroom. I told Dean. I explained that we gave Elvis his medications in envelopes to control his intake and to prevent him from accidentally overdosing on sleeping pills. I told Warlick that as far as I knew, the pills Elvis took this morning were medications I had prescribed, unless the dentist had given him something when he treated him earlier. When the investigators checked Elvis's bathroom, they figured out what they believed happened. Elvis was either sitting down or getting up from the toilet when something sudden happened. Considering his height and the distance from the toilet to the wet spot on the carpet, they thought Elvis stood up, took a step or two forward, and then fell to the floor. Elvis had red carpet fibers in his mouth, which means he was gasping for breath. He might have suffocated from the fibers, or it could have been an automatic reaction the body has right before death. When people die, they don't get enough oxygen to the brain, which can cause a grand mal seizure. That's why Elvis's teeth bit almost completely through his tongue. A lot of things could have happened at the end. The question is, what started it all? Dean was quiet for a moment. Then he jumped back into the conversation. There's a lot more to think about. The maid said Vernon asked them if they had seen David or Rick go up or come down the back stairs off the kitchen before or during the time Elvis was upstairs with Ginger. Why would Vernon want to know that? Doesn't that seem strange? Before I could answer, we arrived at the hospital. The autopsy of Elvis Presley at Baptist Memorial Hospital was the start of a search for the truth that has never ended. If it hadn't been for that single piece of paper Vernon's signature, authorizing the autopsy history, might have recorded a different story. I entered the hospital, where Dick had delivered the signed form. The Assistant Attorney General was still waiting outside the room where Elvis's body lay. He was ready to transfer the body to the city hospital for an autopsy if the coroner decided to do one. But the medical examiner's office had just ruled Elvis's death as natural, so there was no need for a coroner's autopsy. The hospital pathologists could now proceed with Vernon's authorization. This meant the Presley family would own the results, which is standard for a private autopsy. There's a difference between a hospital and a coroner's autopsy. Hospital pathologists are clinical pathologists, while coroner's pathologists are forensic pathologists. Their training and approach are different. A hospital autopsy is more about learning, while a coroner's autopsy is a legal tool to determine the cause and manner of death. Before the autopsy began, the Baptist pathologists and the medical examiner's office agreed to work together. They didn't want to miss anything and face criticism. Dr. Eric Muirhead, the hospital's chief of pathology, would be in charge of the initial visual examination. Dr. Jerry Francisco would be there as a consultant, bringing his own staff, including Dan Warlick, who had investigated Graceland. I was there because I was Elvis's primary doctor and wanted to learn as much as I could. I wondered if Elvis was already dead before the ambulance left Graceland. All I knew was that Joe had heard Elvis breathe. The paramedics wouldn't have moved a body if it was already dead. My mind kept going over the details. As we got ready to start, I could sense tension between Dr. Muirhead and Dr. Francisco. I hoped their differences wouldn't affect the autopsy. There were already other factors at play. Memphis had a history of political disagreements, and some people were upset with Dr. Francisco because of his involvement in police-related cases. The members of the two pathology teams gathered around Elvis. It was hard to see him so exposed. I wanted to cover him with a blanket, but I knew I couldn't. I braced myself for what was to come. Dan Warlick began the initial examination, looking for bruising, needle tracks, or injection sites. He was very thorough. I took notes, knowing I would need to review everything later. The team continued their examination, looking for causes of sudden death like a ruptured aneurysm or a blood clot in the lungs. They found none. There was no evidence of a heart attack or infection. Dr. Francisco had scheduled a press conference at 8 o'clock to announce the results. We knew the world was waiting for answers. About half of the team, including me, went to the press conference. The others stayed behind to finish their work. We walked into the room, most of us wearing our white lab coats. Dr. Francisco announced that the cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia due to an unknown cause. He said it might take days, weeks, or might never be determined. He also said there was no evidence of drug abuse. The other doctors at the table were silent. Later, I heard that Dr. Francisco and Dr. Muirhead had agreed to say the results were inconclusive. Instead, Dr. Francisco made definitive statements. The hospital pathologists felt embarrassed and possibly angry. They thought Dr. Francisco had broken his word. When the press conference ended, I answered questions about rumors of Elvis using drugs. I told them Elvis had been taking an appetite suppressant, but it wasn't an amphetamine. I also said that if Elvis had been using cocaine, I would have known. I had given him a physical just 5 days ago, and he was mostly healthy. The reporters seemed disappointed that they didn't have a more sensational story to report. After the press conference, I went back to the autopsy room. Some specialists were still there, collecting samples for further study. Warlick stayed with the body and later told me he felt a sense of reverence and quiet sadness throughout the process. I learned that 2 sets of samples were being prepared, one for the medical examiner and one for Baptist. Dr. Francisco's samples would go to the University of Tennessee Center for the Health Sciences, while Baptist samples would go to Duckworth Laboratory at Methodist Hospital. It was strange to me that Baptist, the largest private hospital at the time, didn't have its own toxicology lab. I wondered if they were trying to prove their competency or their need for one. Whatever their motivation, it fueled a controversy that has never gone away. On the ride back to Graceland from the hospital, Dean told me about the huge crowd of people grieving at the mansion. They had to call in extra officers to control the crowd and traffic on Elvis Presley Boulevard. The only way to enter Graceland now was through the private rear gate. The mansion was quieter now, but the sadness lingered. Every face I saw reflected the pain of losing Elvis, a friend and a son. I had planned to talk to Vernon about what I knew of Elvis's condition, but when I saw him watching TV tributes from famous people, I couldn't bring myself to disturb his moment of reflection. That night, I headed home, knowing my family would be waiting with the same heavy hearts. Elvis had been a part of our lives for so long. My wife Edna and our daughters, Chrissy and Elaine, loved him like family. Chrissy, whom we called Kissy, and Elaine had known Elvis since they were little, and Edna had always been like a second mom to him. The next morning, I called Dean to check on the plans for the funeral. "The viewing will be at the house from 3 to 5 today," Dean said. Vernon decided to hold the funeral at Graceland for security reasons and to make it easier on Grandma. I was worried about the crowd. Having fans inside Graceland could be dangerous, I said, remembering the chaos at Elvis's concerts. A private service is the best idea with all the celebrities coming. Otherwise, it could turn into a media circus. Yeah, the National Enquirer already has a helicopter circling Graceland, Dean added. Elvis is coming home at noon. Try to get there early. When I arrived at Graceland, I was shocked by the scene. The crowd was massive, estimated at 70,000 people. They surrounded the front gates and filled the streets, making it impossible to move. The heat was unbearable, and many fans were fainting from exhaustion. Paramedics and the Red Cross were on hand to help, but it was chaotic. The front lawn was covered with flowers, and Air National Guardsmen were stationed around the property. It was clear that this was not just a funeral for a famous singer, but also for a soldier who had served his country. Inside, Elvis lay in a copper casket in the marble foyer. I talked to him, hoping he could hear me. "I hope you can see all this, how much people love you," I whispered. I knew how much his fans meant to him, and I felt their pain deeply. Elvis and I had a lot in common. We both grew up in small towns where we felt like outsiders. He told me about his dad being sent to prison, and how hard it was growing up poor. Church was his escape, where he found his voice and his purpose. He joined the army and served with pride, always staying humble and kind. I shared my own story with him, growing up as a Greek immigrant in a small southern town. We both found our way through music and service. I became a doctor, and he became a legendary performer. We talked about our army days in Germany, where he met Priscilla and I found my calling in medicine. Family and friends came to pay their respects, one by one. George Klein, Elvis's longtime friend, was there to help manage the crowd. When the public viewing began, the fans were respectful and deeply sad. Many fainted, but they were quickly helped and returned to the line. The next day, the living room was transformed for the funeral. Chairs replaced the furniture and flowers filled the room. The service opened with prayer and music. Elvis's favorite gospel songs were performed, and the harmony was beautiful. I couldn't focus on the eulogies, thinking instead about how Elvis brought gospel music to new audiences. Vernon and Elvis's grandma were there, holding up as best they could. I was chosen as a pallbearer, a great honor. After the service, we carried Elvis's casket to the hearse. Edna and I rode with Vernon in the first limo, following Elvis to his final resting place. The procession was somber. Police officers and Air National Guard members saluted as we passed. Fans lined the streets, showing their respect. We arrived at Forest Hill Cemetery, and I helped carry Elvis to his final resting place. Vernon and Lisa Marie said their goodbyes, and it was over. We returned to Graceland, where the reality of Elvis's absence hit hard. Friendships would change without him, and the pain of loss was deep. Later, Dean pulled me aside. "Dad, Vernon isn't making any changes to the staff right now," he said. But he asked Dick to find out if someone killed Elvis. I was stunned. "And some reporters are saying they won't stop until they find out what role drugs played in his death," Dean added. Elvis's story had taken a dark turn, and I knew my life would be affected too. The day Elvis died, my eyes were drawn to a photo he had given me, hanging on my wall. It read, "To my good friend and physician, Dr. Nick, Elvis Presley. The reality of his passing was hard to accept, It left a huge void in my life. Even when I wasn't with Elvis, I often thought about him. His spirit had been a constant source of inspiration and challenge. Losing him felt like losing a part of myself. It all began on a chilly Sunday afternoon, February 26, 1967. I was on call at the medical group, sorting through mail when Charlie Hodge called. Charlie was a friend I'd met at a New Year's Eve party. He asked if I could make a house call to his employer, who was in a lot of pain. I suggested bringing him to the clinic, but Charlie explained that the ride might make things worse. So I headed to the Circle G Ranch in Walls, Mississippi, about 10 miles south of Graceland. When I arrived, Charlie led me to a trailer. Inside, Elvis stood with a warm smile, introducing me to his girlfriend, Priscilla. After some friendly introductions, Elvis and I moved to another room for privacy. He was embarrassed but showed me his reddened buttock and inner thighs, inflamed from a week of horseback riding. I treated him with a cool ointment and gave him an antibiotic to prevent infection. He told me he needed to leave for a movie shoot the next day, but was worried about how he'd feel. Before I left, Elvis asked if I could check on his grandma, who was sick. She lived at Graceland, and I agreed to stop by on my way back to Memphis. Minnie Me Presley was in her mid-70s, suffering from a bronchial infection and asthma. I chatted with her, warned her about signs of pneumonia, and left some prescriptions. Elvis called and asked me to come back to the ranch. I thought about calling him, but he wasn't near a phone, so I drove back. He explained that the movie cast and crew were in Hollywood, and he was worried about the cost if he didn't show up on time. He decided to tell his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, he'd be delayed. Elvis handed me the phone, and Parker asked me to encourage Elvis to get to Hollywood as soon as possible. As I was leaving, one of Elvis's guys stopped me. Elvis wanted to show me his land. We climbed into a dusty pickup and drove around his 163 acres of rolling fields. Elvis seemed relaxed and enjoyed sharing his pride in the ranch. He was a warm and interesting person, and I got the sense he just wanted to talk to someone outside his inner circle. Before I left, Elvis thanked me. It was a sincere and kind remark, and I told him the best way to thank me was to let me go home. He laughed, and that was the start of our decade-long friendship. The next day, I went to Graceland to check on Elvis and give him letters for the insurance company. He shared that he had trouble sleeping and sometimes took sedatives. He also mentioned using amphetamines to stay awake during long drives and early call times on movie sets. When I asked about drug allergies, he said codeine made him itch, which was unusual. Elvis planned to live on the West Coast, making 3 movies a year, but he said he'd call me for any health issues when he was in Memphis. I agreed, but I didn't expect to treat him again. 3 months later, Elvis and Priscilla got married in Las Vegas. They moved to Graceland, and in February 1968, Priscilla was ready to give birth. Elvis called me, and I rushed to the hospital. By the time I arrived, he was pacing in the waiting room with his entourage. Priscilla was getting dolled up before meeting the press. When the baby arrived, Elvis was overjoyed. He was so excited, he forgot to pass out the cigars. In 1969, Elvis faced another medical emergency during a recording session. He developed laryngitis and tonsillitis with a fever. I left him medicine with clear instructions, but when I returned, it was all gone. He had taken the entire week's worth in one day. I was stunned, realizing he had a high tolerance for certain medications. He believed taking all his medicine at once would help him get well faster. Elvis returned to live performances in Las Vegas on July 31st, 1969. He was nervous about how his fans would react after such a long absence. He invited friends and celebrities to support him. The energy in the room was electric. When Elvis stepped on stage, he was fit, trim, and gorgeous. The audience went wild. After the show, we celebrated in his hotel suite. Elvis was grateful to everyone who had come to support him. Elvis signed a 5-year contract to perform at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. He was thrilled, but he found it stressful to record a live album while performing. Despite the challenges, he set all performance records on the Las Vegas Strip. When Elvis returned to Vegas in 1970, he invited us again. Edna was excited and dressed up beautifully. Elvis had a cold, and the dry Las Vegas air was affecting his voice. Having a doctor on hand was a huge relief. His anxiety before each show was intense, but it vanished the moment he stepped on stage. The audience's energy charged him up, and by the end of each performance, he was vibrating with excitement. Elvis's fans were his battery, and he thrived on their support. Watching him perform was like seeing a different person. The more his fans got involved, the more energized he became. After the show, it took a while for him to calm down. But every time he stepped on stage, he was transformed, and the magic was undeniable. Parker saw the perfect opportunity to bring Elvis to an even bigger stage, booking him for the Texas Livestock Show at the Houston Astrodome in February 1970. Before the show, Elvis and his entourage drove around the football field in a dozen convertibles, waving to the massive crowd. Despite the grand setup, Elvis was a nervous wreck. He had always preferred intimate venues, where he could connect with his audience face to face. The Astrodome, with its vast open space and poor acoustics, felt like the floor of an ocean to him. But when it was showtime, Elvis poured his heart and soul into his performance, breaking all previous concert records with 6 sold-out shows in 3 days. When Elvis returned to Las Vegas in August, I started going out there a few days early to help him prepare for his shows. After the shows began, I would go back to Memphis to treat other patients, and then return to Vegas for the closing. Elvis had met a physician at the hotel who would take care of him when I wasn't around, but I still had obligations in Memphis. During this time, Elvis told me about a serious kidnapping threat. He was especially worried about the safety of his daughter, Lisa Marie, and added extra security around his Los Angeles home. Elvis was very aware of the media's coverage of violence, especially the recent assassinations of Dr. Martin, Luther King Jr., and Robert F. Kennedy. He felt these events were too close to home, and believed he could be a target. While some might have thought Elvis was being paranoid, given the historical context, his fears were understandable. To address the security issues, Elvis had customized tour jackets made for his bodyguards and aides. This helped him know where his security was positioned during concerts. However, it also led to some problems. People could now identify who was part of Elvis's team, and there were complaints about the strong arm tactics of some bodyguards. Elvis decided to get deputy sheriff badges for all the places he had residences, allowing us to carry concealed weapons. He even took classes and exams to qualify for a gun permit, and he became an avid collector of firearms. He would often listen to police scanners, ride his motorcycle to crime scenes, and even direct traffic. Most cops found it amusing, but Elvis was genuinely passionate about it. In September 1970, Elvis went on his first tour since the 50s. The added pressure of being an easy target on stage, combined with filming the documentary Elvis, That's the Way It Is, took a toll on him. He was responsible for every aspect of his stage show and personal business, which added to his anxiety. More often, Elvis wanted me to visit him on the road to discuss things he couldn't talk about over the phone. He needed someone to listen and help him relieve the pressure. During his January 1971 engagement, Elvis came down with the flu and wasn't feeling well. I stayed in Las Vegas for a couple of weeks, which caused problems at home and in my practice. It was a difficult balancing act, but I understood how much Elvis needed me. In March 1971, Elvis called from Nashville, complaining of severe eye pain. He left his recording session and went to a doctor, who recommended he be hospitalized. I called Dr. Spencer Thornton, an ophthalmologist and my former professor, who confirmed that Elvis was in serious condition. He arranged for Elvis to stay at a hotel attached to Baptist Hospital, and I brought Dr. David Mayer, the top ophthalmologist in Tennessee, to give a second opinion. When we arrived, Dr. Mayer examined Elvis and gave a frightening diagnosis. The pressure in Elvis's right eye was over 80, which could lead to blindness if not treated immediately. Dr. Mayer had to either make a hole in Elvis's iris or inject steroids directly into his eye. Despite the pain, Elvis tried to lighten the mood by asking if Dr. Mayer had done this before. Dr. Mayer assured him he could handle it and asked if Elvis could sit still. Elvis nodded, and Dr. Mayer proceeded with the injection. The room was tense, but everyone understood the gravity of the situation. With the help of Dr. Mayer, Elvis's eye was saved. But it was a close call that highlighted the many challenges Elvis faced both on and off the stage. Elvis's journey through the early 1970s was a roller coaster of success and struggle. After the intense and life-saving procedure in his eye, Elvis's resilience and discipline amazed everyone, especially Dr. Mayer. His karate training had honed his mind and body, allowing him to endure the pain and pressure of the treatment. Despite the challenges, Elvis's performances continued to break records, especially in Lake Tahoe and Las Vegas, where he played to packed houses and delivered some of the most memorable shows of his career. However, the relentless schedule began to take its toll. Elvis was performing 2 shows a night, sometimes 3, and the physical and emotional strain was becoming overwhelming. His health issues, including sinus problems, migraines, and exhaustion, were constant companions. The bright lights and smoke-filled rooms only added to his discomfort. Despite this, Elvis's dedication to his fans kept him going. He thrived on their energy and their responses, which fueled his performances. In August 1972, Elvis faced another challenge when Priscilla moved out of Graceland with their daughter, Lisa Marie. The personal loss added to his stress, but he pushed forward, even performing a series of shows at Madison Square Garden. The New York City gigs were a huge success, but the pressure and the discovery that some of his closest aides were using drugs left him feeling betrayed and exhausted. Elvis's relationships with his band, crew, and personal staff were strained. He held himself and everyone around him to high standards, and the constant pressure to perform perfectly was taking a toll. Despite the challenges, Elvis found moments of joy and relaxation when he returned to Memphis. It was during one of these visits that he met Linda Thompson, who would become a significant presence in his life over the next few years. Linda's beauty and affection provided a bright spot in Elvis's world, and she was well liked by his entourage. In January 1973, Elvis's career reached a new pinnacle with the Aloha from Hawaii satellite concert. The show was broadcast to over 1 billion people worldwide, making Elvis a global icon like never before. The performance was a triumph, but the intense preparation and the pressure of the event left Elvis drained. After the concert, he returned to Las Vegas, but his health issues continued to worsen. A throat ailment and a security incident left him deeply troubled, and he struggled to maintain his usual high standards. Elvis's friends and staff began to notice changes in him. He was more agitated and less able to cope with the demands of his schedule. Despite his legendary status, Elvis was human, and the toll of his grueling lifestyle was becoming apparent. He canceled several shows in Vegas, and his friends and doctors were concerned about his well-being. Elvis's story is one of incredible talent and resilience, but it is also a reminder of the personal costs of fame. His journey through the early 1970s was marked by both triumph and struggle, and his legacy continues to inspire and captivate people around the world. Despite the challenges, Elvis's passion for music and his dedication to his fans remained unwavering, making him a true icon of his time.